Seconds to go. That question will be hanging for quite some time, and Boris Johnson faces a huge task, not to open English champagne tonight, but to show to voters that they made the right decisions by putting their faith in him and his belief that this was the right choice for all of us.
So there's the countdown clock, 25 seconds, 24 until we leave the EU. There are thousands of people waiting around the corner in Parliament Square, waiting to celebrate that moment. For very many people, though, a very different atmosphere tonight. Let's leave it now. 10 seconds to go. And there you have it, the recorded sound of Big Ben in Downing Street. We are no longer a member of the European Union. The scenes there in Parliament Square, where the celebrations begin. And so begins the next chapter for the United Kingdom. We have now formally left the EU after 47 years. We are no longer EU citizens. Let's go straight to Parliament Square now, and Vicky Young, who is there.
Yeah, and there may have been muted celebrations in Downing Street tonight. That has not been the case here. All evening, speeches from leading Brexiteers, singing, chanting, renditions of God Save the Queen, Rule Britannia. And then, in the final moments before we left the European Union, Nigel Farage, the person many credit with putting pressure on the Conservative Party and making sure that Brexit happened. Tonight, as he addressed the crowds here, he said some people said this wasn't to be celebrated. He said it was. It was a victory, he said, for democracy. He said we beat the establishment who didn't want the referendum. They didn't want this to happen. But he also said that this wasn't the end, that there would be battles ahead, and he would be standing by to make sure that Boris Johnson did deliver when it comes to things like fishing, when it comes to making sure that the European Court of Justice doesn't have a role. He says he will be keeping an eye on what goes on in the next year. And absolutely huge cheers here as that moment came.
Well, we'll leave the celebrations there in Parliament Square for now, and we are going to go to our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy, who is on the border, the new border between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Emma.
Well, all of a sudden, this invisible geographical line takes on a great new significance. This, where I'm standing, is now the new land border between the UK and the EU. There was no great fanfare, no singing. A small band of protesters gathered here to mark the moment. To the eye, of course, nothing will change, but it will have implications for thousands of businesses across the island. Now, keeping this border open was always such a difficult part of those Brexit negotiations. In the end, a resolution was found through a controversial compromise, which effectively moves this border to the Irish Sea. It leaves Northern Ireland in a bit of a halfway house in future, abiding by EU single market rules, but staying part of the new UK's global trading arrangements. And of course, don't forget, it was always so important to people to keep this border open, because having an open Irish border has been a fundamental part of the peace process in Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. It has been achieved, but people are still far from happy. A majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain. They're still upset they're being taken out of the EU against their will, whereas others are angry that Northern Ireland is going to have to remain in different arrangements to the rest of the UK. But after all those rows, those battles over British and Irish identity, really now negotiations over the next 11 months will determine exactly how it's all going to work in practice.
Emma Vardy, thank you. Well, Wales voted to leave the EU by virtually the same percentage as the UK as a whole, 52 to 48%. Hal Griffiths is at a rugby club at Taffs Well, just outside Cardiff for us now. And the mood there this evening?
Well, a few people raised their glasses here. People obviously thinking about big European battles tomorrow on the pitch as Wales take on Italy. But Wales has been a battleground during the Brexit debate. A majority of people voted here for it. And just in December, the Brexit debate had a real impact on the Welsh political landscape. And joined by two people who were kind of on either side of that divide, Jane and Chris. Now, Jane, you voted for Brexit, even though you've lived in Spain and in France and think you've got quite an European perspective. We've seen the Brexit clock there. What are your feelings now?
Very, very sad. After having lived in both Brittany and Andalusia, the welcome that I had from the people, very, very sad.
So why did you vote for Brexit?
Economic, because I feel that Spain has got one of the highest unemployment with children, etc., teenagers. Italy is in a mess, Greece is in a mess, and I feel even Spain and even France is not out of the woods yet.
So you think we're better off out of it,
Definitely.
But Chris, that's not your feeling?
Yeah, as a small business, I feel that leaving could do us some damage. We don't know how long it's going to last, if we are stay out or if we go back in. So, yeah.
And we're told that it could be a trade deal on the way. But you're not that optimistic?
No, I believe it when I see it, to be honest with you.
OK, thank you both for joining us late tonight at the Rugby Club. There will be plenty of Brexit debates left in Wales, a country which has benefited hugely, £5 billion over 20 years from EU funding. No one quite certain yet how the new funding model, the Shared Prosperity Fund, will work. Some, even the First Minister, claiming devolution could be rolled back if that's controlled by Whitehall. So I don't think we've heard the end of the Brexit debate here in Wales.
Hal Griffith, thank you. Well, let's go to Edinburgh now. Sarah Smith is there, and the atmosphere there now.
Defiant, I would say, Sophie. At the moment of 11 o'clock, the pretty large crowd, hundreds of demonstrators outside the Parliament now, were singing Auld Lang Syne. And then as the clock struck 11, that was replaced with chants of Independence Now, which gives you a pretty clear idea of what people here want. The speakers earlier have been talking about the fight is not over. They say they battled for 3.5 years to stop Scotland being taken out of the EU after it had voted to remain. But now the battle moves on for many of the people here, for many in the nationalist movement, to try and get an independence referendum, try and secure independence for Scotland, and then take that independent country back into the EU. So, I mean, the moment we've left already, the people here are talking about how they want to try and rejoin the EU as an independent Scotland. And that's very much the mood here, that Brexit will fuel independence, these people think and hope, and that's why they're here tonight.
Sarah Smith in Edinburgh, thank you. And let's show you Parliament Square again now. And the party is continuing there. People singing patriotic songs. Nigel Farage has addressed the crowd, and they heard recorded sound of Big Ben at 11 o'clock on the dot. Well, let's talk to our media editor, Amol Rajan, who has been looking at how our exit from the EU is being reported in tomorrow's papers. Amol.
Yes, indeed, Sophie. Newspaper hacks live for nights like this. This is a chance to create a front-page splash that lives for the ages and capture the mood of the nation. It's a big test for editors and their designers, and moreover, it's one that, unlike with election nights, I've actually had time to plan for. Let's have a look at the first one. Here's a bit of a surprise. This is the Daily Mail, which has been absolutely central to shaping the national conversation over Brexit. It had a very Brexity front page this morning, celebration of Brexit Day, but it's actually left Brexit off the front page altogether, and it's leading with the coronavirus. Let's move on to the next one. This is I think this is the Sun that we've got next. Let's have a look at this. Make leave, not war. This led on Boris Johnson's message for tonight, which is a sort of optimistic and positive one, and we'll rattle through the rest of them. This is the Express newspaper, which is leading with a metaphor of a new dawn, one that another paper leads with as well, and a picture of some waving flags, which is a common theme. Then we move on to the Eye, a non-partisan paper, which asks the question of where we are going next, with another picture of the interesting events outside Parliament Square. The Daily Mirror also has a new dawn. The Daily Mirror, which was against Brexit, though many of its readers actually supported it, says now build the Britain we were promised. The Daily Telegraph, which has been very supportive of Boris Johnson, leads with more flags, says Johnson ramps up the pressure on the EU. The Scotsman says Sturgeon's fresh appeal for patience in the battle for Indy Ref 2. And the next paper is The Guardian, which leads with an essayistic look at events from Jonathan Freeland. I think we've got that there. And I think it's fair to say many of the papers have led with an optimistic message, even if they opposed it. FT leads with Britain finally cuts EU ties. They tend to play these events straight. Let's roll on and see the next one. This is, I think, The Guardian. Should be there. Yes, The Day We Said Goodbye. It's an essay from Jonathan Freedland. A reflective essay rather than a news story. And I think the final one is The Times, which has a picture of a car outside Parliament waving a flag, and farewell to EU. I think it's fair to say, Sophie, it's a big test of newspapers, and some of them passed with flying colours, literally.
Amol, thank you. Well, let's go to Downing Street now and talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who is there for us. And Laura, that is the big question, isn't it? What is next? What comes now?
Well, what comes next, first of all, is a long, long period of hard bargaining between the UK and the EU. The UK government determined to try to get a free trade deal done by the end of this year, but that will not be straightforward, not least because there's so many things that have to be sorted out, but also because the EU will drive a hard bargain. Yes, both sides say, of course, we want to still be friends and partners, we want to be respectful neighbours, and people want to do lots of business with each other. But the UK government has already acknowledged that that will mean some friction, to use the technical terms, and also, until it's all done and dusted, it means still uncertainty for businesses and people around the country who want to know exactly what is next. But although there is legions of details to be worked out, many more political controversies along the way, be in no doubt the fundamental question which has been hanging over this place and hanging over the country for more than 3 years has been settled, and that's already completely changed the political dynamic and therefore the dynamic in the country too.
And Katja Adler in Brussels, we've heard a lot of warm words from the EU over the past few days, but in terms of negotiations from now on, they're going to be tough, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. You do have to wonder, Sophie, when the warm words might turn into gritted teeth. We did hear, even today, from the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli. He said, you know, the EU will always see the UK kind of as a brother, but we know that when it comes to family feuds, they can be the most bitter of all. We've already heard government ministers saying, why is the EU already talking about imposing conditions on us, the UK, to get a free trade agreement that it didn't do with Japan, for example, or with Canada? But you see, Japan and Canada don't share the same kind of intimate history or geography that the UK does with the EU. The EU looks at the UK and thinks overnight this could become a huge competitor on our doorstep. So when the EU looks at this post-Brexit UK now and says, you know, we love you, but we're not going to do any favours at the negotiating table, you can believe them, Sophie.
And Laura, we've seen tonight vigils in Cambridgeshire, we've seen the scene outside Holyrood, we've also seen this party that's been taking place in Parliament Square. The Prime Minister has talked today about a new chapter in the UK story and also about bringing together our divided nation.
That's right, Sophie, because new chapters, of course, bring new tensions. And one of the things, you know, Brexit did not go neatly down party lines. It created new political identities, if you like. It created a new battleground. It changed, it redrew the map of politics that had really been so dominant here for so long, and it brought in questions of identity, who people felt they were. Did they feel that they were someone who was attached to the idea of being close to our continental neighbours, or did they feel that they wanted Britain to have more control over its own affairs? And that sort of identity politics, to forgive the terrible jargon, is what came to dominate how things worked in Westminster in the last couple of years. Remember, people were kicked out of the Tory party, the Labour Party had huge arguments about it, the SNP, of course, using Brexit to strengthen their case as they see it in a clamour for Scottish independence, and of course all the issues that we've talked about so many times around the Northern Irish border. It's very unclear at the moment whether or not the traditional political jigsaw is going to be put back together again. But it's also Brexit that was a big part of the reason that the Tories managed to achieve such a success at the general election. And that means, in that sense, we're now living in a very different era, because we have a government that will be able to do what they want, to be able to get their business done in Parliament. And that, too, creates a very different political landscape. Huge opportunities for this government, this relatively new Prime Minister. Huge risks and maybe huge pitfalls too. And no excuses now. That EU bogeyman that all British politicians have been so fond of blaming from time to time isn't there anymore.
Well, Laura Kuenssberg and Katya Adler, who have both reported on every twist and turn of that story, both thank you very much. We are out of the EU. It has certainly been a long and bumpy road to get to this point. 3.5 years after the EU referendum, celebrations and commiserations across the country tonight. A new chapter in the UK's story. Time to heal the divisions of the last few years, says the Prime Minister. We are setting out on a new path, on our own now. This time next year, once the transition period is over, life could be different for all of us as the UK begins to forge its new identity on the world stage. The Union flags are flying over Westminster and Whitehall tonight. We wait to see what our new future holds. Good night.
A very good evening. Brexit has happened. Just 15 minutes ago, the UK ceased to be a member of the European Union.
Let's just hear that big moment in British history again when the clock counted down to 11 o'clock, sparking celebrations in London's Parliament Square.
Wow! Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's the national anthem.